Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Disaster Bundles Deep Dive Part 2 for the Pediatric Readiness Quality Collaborative. We will be starting this session shortly, but just a couple reminders. Today's session will be recorded and available on our file sharing site that you see listed here. For the entire call, the attendees will be muted, but please submit your questions through the chat function, and we'll try our best to answer those questions between the learning session this time and also at the end. And then if there are any additional questions, we'll be sure to cover those during office hours and post on the website. So if everyone can wait about 2 more minutes, we're going to wait for some of the other attendees to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. We'll start with a couple housekeeping before we get started. Welcome to the Pediatric Readiness Quality Collaborative's Disaster Bundle Deep Dive. During today's session, we will have some information related specifically to the disaster bundle. There will be time for question and answer, so we encourage you to use the chat function. We will be providing CME, CNE credit for today's session, and we'll provide you with links to that immediately following the session. So I'd like to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to the Pediatric Readiness Quality Collaborative's Disaster Planning for a Pediatric Population. As far as acknowledgments, we want you to keep in mind that the EIAC is supported in part by HRSA. The information or content that you see today should not be construed as the official policy or position of the entities that are listed here. For today's session, we are offering CNE and CME credit. You'll see the link that's listed here, and please list Disaster Deep Dive Part 2 as the name of today's session. Here are our talking points. So we have a recap of the disaster bundle domains 1 through 4. We'll have time to discuss the workflows or process maps for those domains. Our team has put together some disaster scenarios that your site can use for disaster exercises. So we'll walk through those. We'll discuss the environmental scan, and then lastly end with office hours and housekeeping. I'm joined today by Dr. Kate Remick, Dr. Brent Kasney, and Dr. Ariel Johnson-Fusco. And what we'll do is go ahead and get started with a reminder of our subject matter experts. Kate, you want to jump in?
Great, thanks, Crystal, and good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. We're really grateful to have the support of a number of subject matter experts who helped with this particular intervention bundle, as many of you know. So first off, Dr. Steve Krug. He's professor of pediatrics at Northwestern. He also chairs the American Academy of Pediatrics Disaster Preparedness Advisory Council and is current chair of emergency medicine at Lurie Children's in Chicago. We're also grateful to have the help and support of Dr. Brent Kasney. He's an assistant professor of pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine. He is overseeing disaster preparedness efforts at Texas Children's Hospital and is the disaster domain lead for the EMS for Children Innovation and Improvement Center. We're also grateful to have Patricia Frost, or Pat Frost. She is the Director of Emergency Medical Services at Contra Costa Health Services and one of the leads for the National Pediatric Disaster Preparedness Coalition. If you move to the next slide, we also are welcoming Dr. Ariel Johnson-Fusco. She's a Pediatric Emergency Medicine Fellow at Jill Children's Medical Center at the University of Texas in Austin, and is a very specific interest in disaster preparedness efforts, has done a lot of work to help support this intervention bundle. Oscar Enriquez is an emergency medical technician and the coordinator for emergency preparedness activities at Jill Children's Medical Center. Laura Aird, who is manager for disaster preparedness and response efforts at the American Academy of Pediatrics. And lastly, Brianna Smith, who is the program coordinator for emergency readiness within the American Academy of Pediatrics. So we're grateful to have all of their support, and some of them will be joining us today, as you'll hear from. So for those of you who recall, the goal of the disaster preparedness bundle is really to try to fortify your readiness to deal with pediatric disasters when and if they occur. We know that less than 50% of hospitals across the United States have disaster plans that include pediatric specific needs. And so the goal is to try to give you some resources and support to implement local disaster preparedness efforts. This bundle, unlike many of the other intervention bundles, is focused on simulated events or disaster drills. As you know, intervention bundles 1, 2, and 3 on weight and kilos, abnormal vitals, and then interfacility transfers are focused on actual chart reviews or patient care records that you'll be looking at the performance of day-to-day readiness. In this bundle, it's going to be focused on actually creating local, site-specific disaster drills to look at the effectiveness of the efforts on site. So our particular aim for this bundle is that by December of 2019, 100% of the sites that are participating in this particular intervention bundle will have a plan that addresses the 4 essential domains of pediatric disaster preparedness that are included in phase 1. So that's having pediatric disaster coordination, having internal coalition building, being able to determine effective pediatric surge capacity, and to identify essential pediatric resources. As we enter into phase 2, we'll begin talking about the other 3 domains, but those will be implemented on or after January of 2019. So if we move to the next slide. These again are the disaster domains that we're focusing on. So phase 1, you'll see here domains 1, 2, 3, and 4. And eventually we will be getting to triage, decontamination, and tracking and reunification, but that'll come, as I just mentioned, in 2019. You'll see with domains 2 and 3, coalition building and pediatric surge capacity, that we've divided this into local and regional efforts. So local efforts for the purposes of this bundle essentially are defined as within your site, within your facility or your hospital, working with internal departments and internal resources. Regional, meaning working with any other stakeholders or partners within your community that are supporting disaster preparedness efforts. And typically this is through an already existing regional disaster coalition. So for the purposes of recap, remember that with phase 1, really our recommendation is to start with domain 1 and to slowly progress through domains to domain 4. There is no expectation that as a site participating in this intervention bundle that you will complete all 7 domains, but we want to provide those opportunities for those of you that are able to work quickly through this based on the support and buy-in that you have from other leaders at your site. The minimum expectation for participating in this bundle is that you will complete at least domain 1, meaning that you will have some type of pediatric representation on your emergency preparedness committee, and that pediatrics will be integrated into the overarching disaster preparedness plan for your site. Phase 2 will be released in January of 2019, and that will then cover triage, decontamination, tracking, reunification, and again, only for those sites who are ready to move on to those domains. Go to the next slide. So domain 1, when we talk about pediatric disaster coordination, this refers to the integration of pediatric specific needs. So we know that all sites are required by CMS to have some all hazards disaster preparedness plan, and that those plans really should include the needs of children, because we can never predict when, where, and to what extent these disasters or events will involve children and families. And so these disaster plans really require us to identify the specific needs of children in our communities and make sure that we're leading a cooperative effort across all hospital departments, personnel, and leadership. Again, the goal is to focus on an all hazards approach. And so what are the top hazards that you and your community need to prepare for? And these disaster plan will integrate those unique needs and responses for the pediatric patient. The second domain, just by way of recap, is coalition building, and we talk about local versus regional. So on a regional scale, we're talking about collaboration with other stakeholder groups within your region or community. So these can be public health entities, they can be EMS agencies, they can be law enforcement, fire departments, they may be schools, shelters, but coordination across all these other entities to help support preparation, response, and recovery in the event of an emergency or disaster. But in addition, we know that there is a need to focus on local coalition building, and this really speaks to the coordination of internal departments within your particular facility. So we need to make sure that not just the clinical, but also the non-clinical departments are working in a coordinated way regarding communication and response to be able to help support the overall mission during a disaster situation. And so this really, this focus is on how many internal departments are actually engaged in disaster preparedness efforts and how quickly or efficiently are we able to move through that response. The next slide focuses on domain 3, which is on pediatric surge capacity, again, looking at both regional and local efforts. So internally, when we talk about internal surge capacity, it is how many patients, specifically pediatric patients, can we accept or manage within the emergency department setting, within our operating capabilities and our operating suites, and also within inpatient capabilities from both inpatient wards to intensive care unit settings, and making sure that we can determine that quickly so that we know exactly how many patients we can accept from the scene based on ages and criticality, and how many patients would actually need to be transported to alternative facilities or sites. This, of course, goes hand in hand with any potential regional disaster coalition. So if there is a regional disaster coalition that your site is participating in, it will be how do we work with those other institutions, those other stakeholder groups to identify our regional surge capacity to handle these children. In other words, if they can't go to your specific site, where can they go, and who has the resources and capabilities of handling those patients. And then our last slide, or the last domain that we're going to be focusing on, is essential pediatric resources. And this refers to those essential resources that we don't always think about when it comes to handling children in the setting of a disaster. What are their bedding needs? What are their dietary needs across all age groups, from thinking about formula to pureed or baby foods to G-tube needed support to regular dietary needs. We also think about children with special healthcare needs having backup generators and ventilator capabilities and the like. So what are the essential pediatric resources that we have available to meet the needs of children in our community in the setting of a disaster, and how do these correlate with our actual surge capacity? And so those are the 4 domains that we'll be talking about. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that this is just a snapshot of the PR2 Disaster Bundle, and it walks through, the whole table of contents, all the different domains and what's available. This has now been updated with the process maps that Dr. Kazmi will be reviewing today, and you can access these from the box site. So be looking for those so that you can be able to walk your way through. If you go to the next slide, Crystal.
Yeah, it's the process map.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Kazmi to be able to walk through each of these process maps. And remember, the goal of today was really to help break it down into, the implementation of this particular disaster bundle domain. And as you recall, this is, there's a lot of domains within this particular bundle, unlike some of the others. So we want to try to simplify it as much as possible. So Dr. Kazmi?
Hey, thank you guys. Thanks for having me. And I hope everyone's having a good day. I think that really what our goal today was to walk through these process maps that we're hoping simplify the bundle a bit for everyone. I think we recognize that looking at all the bundles, the disaster bundle can seem a bit kind of daunting and intimidating just in its length, but I think breaking it down into kind of individual objectives really simplifies it. And I'm hoping that reviewing these process maps will assist people in understanding how to work through this in a kind of organized and logical way. Just before I get started in the individual maps, just kind of some review on the process maps in general. Really, bubbles presented on the maps represent kind of beginning and end points. Diamonds are kind of questions or branching points, and boxes are steps along the way. And you'll see that there's some different colors in the process maps. The red boxes and diamonds and bubbles tend to capture actual structural measures that are outlined in the bundle. And the green boxes are kind of action items, some quite simple and some maybe a little bit more involved. And the blue are just steps along the way. So getting started, let's kind of go ahead and take a look at the first map here. And what we're going to do is really just, this map covers domain 1. And we're really going to just kind of go stepwise through this and take a look at it to try and explain things. And we'll do questions at the end of each of these maps, trying to at least capture some of the high points for people. So disaster domain 1, again, is regarding pediatric disaster coordination. And I think really pivotal to anybody's success in pursuing this bundle in general is going to be identifying and recognizing who does emergency management, who is your emergency manager locally at your facility. There are a number of Joint Commission and CMS requirements that relate to emergency management. So someone has been tasked with this at your facility, and identifying who that person is going to be quite important. So really, at the very jump-off point for this, we wanted to start with just saying, do you know who your emergency manager is? And getting their information in some sort of organized way, because it's somebody that you're going to be questioning and working closely with as you go further through this bundle. If you don't know who that person is, it's obviously going to be very important to find out who they are. So looking at the org structure for your facility and trying to reach out to emergency management to identify this person is going to be, again, extremely important, as they may have a lot of this information already on hand and very readily available to help you work through the bundle. Moving forward, you'll see that what we really have done in this process map is divide the domain 1 into kind of 2 separate parts that work down and then across this map. The first part is really related to the presence of pediatric specific expertise engaged and involved in emergency management at your facility. And to that end, we've asked if there is a committee that specifically works on these issues, such as an emergency management committee, or if it's just one individual that's really heading up these efforts. If there isn't a committee, we suggest seeing what it would take to form a committee like that at your facility to get a broader breadth and depth of knowledge regarding emergency management in general, and recognizing that a lot of these places, especially critical access hospitals, may be resource limited in that it may be difficult for that one person that's doing emergency management to do their job, and assisting them with some additional expertise could be extremely valuable. If there is a committee, we ask if there's pediatric expertise on that committee, or if there's a pediatric specific person that's been appointed, something akin kind of to the pediatric emergency care coordinator, but specific to disaster. It could be the same person that serves that role as the PECC for that facility. And then what we've done is said if there is not somebody with pediatric expertise, we've suggested qualifications for adding pediatric expertise, and that's attached in that resource guide that Dr. Remick mentioned at the beginning of this group of slides. And we have some outlined qualifications that we think that person should hold. If there is someone with pediatric expertise, obviously getting their information in addition to the information of the emergency manager is going to be important. And this is actually completes structural measure number 1C for this bundle, which is identifying a pediatric point person for disaster preparedness at your facility. So this is kind of the first step along the way in pursuing this disaster bundle, which is really identifying those people that are key to disaster preparedness or response at your facility, whether that's simply your emergency manager, or if is an entire committee that's working on this issue, and identifying if there's anybody that has actual specific pediatric specific expertise in this area. The second kind of wave of questions and things to identify in this process map and in domain 1 is really related more specifically to your hospital's disaster policy or plan. And again, this is something that should be present, as these are Joint Commission requirements, and so there is some plan. The question is, how usable is it, and does it involve or include the specific needs of children in it? So really, again, getting a copy of the plan is going to be step 1, and that your emergency manager or whoever works in that area should be able to provide that with you pretty readily and pretty easily. And then reviewing that maybe with them to see if there are pediatric specific needs that are captured in that plan is going to be important. And again, this is structural measure number 1A. If there are not pediatric specific needs, we recommend and reference the EMS for Children checklist to identify specific needs to include. And then moving across this group of boxes and diamonds, you'll see that if pediatric specific needs are included, we question if there's a minimum of, this moves on kind of to a drilling part, which should be somewhat captured in the policy or plan. And we see if drill objectives address pediatric specific issues. So when drills are conducted at your facility, do the objectives for those drills identify or include pediatric specific needs or issues? If they don't, we ask that be added to the plan. If they do, we ask specifically what number of children may be suggested or recommended in your policy or plan, or if there's a percentage of patients that are involved in the drill that need to be children as outlined by your plan. And then if this is not kind of apparent in the policy, we suggest you review resources for pediatric tabletop exercises, which are outlined again in the resource guide that was mentioned at the beginning of this. Our hope is that ultimately, through working through this, we will be able to not only identify those individuals at your facility that are working on emergency management through that top vertical bar of questions and boxes, but ensure that there is some sort of pediatric specific expertise or individual that's involved in specifically in disaster preparedness for your facility. And then kind of the second part of this is just really looking specifically at your hospital's disaster policy or plan and seeing if there is the inclusion of children in the plan. And then moving on from that, looking specifically to see if that plan outlines or addresses drilling and more specifically addressing the needs of children in these drills, as well as minimum number of children in the drills. As you'll see, this final last red box, identify what % of patients in your last drill were children. So this is our hope, is that the last drill that was conducted at your facility, you can get from emergency management some basic information regarding the patients that were involved in that drill and see what % overall of those patients were pediatric patients. And again, this is structural measure number 1B. Really, after completing that, domain 1 is essentially complete. And at the end of that, we should have been able to either identify pediatric expertise in emergency management at your facility, and if it's not present, assist in the implementation and inclusion of somebody with pediatric expertise, and then identify your disaster policy or plan, recognizing if the need to include pediatric specific needs if not already included, and then just some basic information regarding the number of patients that are pediatric in annual drills that are held at your facility. So with that and completing kind of an overview of the domain 1 process map, I'd ask if there are any questions that we could maybe address now before moving on to the next 2 process maps that cover kind of in combination domains 2, 3, and 4.
And for those of you on the call, remember that we can't necessarily hear you, but if you just add your questions to the chat box, if you have any specific to domain 1, then we can address them.
If not, obviously we'll be available for questions later and in office hours, which we will mention at the end of this talk. And I can move on to the other process maps if no one has any outstanding questions at present.
So we had one question. It's from Jennifer Greer, and the question is, I'm needing help finding the EMSC checklist that you referenced. So if you visit the file sharing site, you'll see there's a section under Domain 1 under the intervention bundle that reads EMSC checklist or starting point. The documents are there. But what I can do, Jennifer, oh, I'm sorry. She says that she can't find an EMSC checklist that identifies pediatric specific needs.
So that would be the EMSC checklist that you're mentioning, Crystal. That's
okay.
Regarding pediatric specific disaster preparedness.
So Jennifer, what I'll do is send you a link to that actual document. Any other questions?
This was a document created in 2014, and it was for every hospital to develop a disaster plan that includes those pediatric specific needs. And it actually focuses on 14 domains. And what we tried to do here was to narrow it down to the most critical sort of foundational starting points. So Jennifer and those of you on the call, when you do review that document, please know that it is very comprehensive, but for the purposes of this collaborative and the work that we're doing here, we've whittled it down to just a few of those most critical domains. Are there any other questions, Crystal?
Yes. So I'm not sure, Steve, if they can see your question, but you're a panelist, so you can go ahead and make the comment. Steve? Okay, I think he's still connecting. But Steve Krug, one of our subject matter experts, mentioned that the goal is to get children included in drills and over time increase the number of children so that surge capacity can be assessed.
Yeah, and that's really our hope, is just that kind of identifying a starting point for where your facility is at and what they've done in past drills and what percentage of patients included in those drills have been children will give you kind of a benchmark for hopeful improvement as we kind of continue to roll out aspects of the bundle and interventions that you'll be working towards. If there are no additional questions, we can move on to the next process map. This process map is really more specific to the local coalition building, pediatric surge capacity, and essential pediatric resources. And you can see that it's has a couple of different arms to it, but really kind of a straight shot down of a couple of main questions, then building towards, this is about regional coalition building and pediatric surge capacity. I apologize, I got confused there. And covers kind of a combination of domains 2 and 3, looking kind of both in a combination of kind of local as well as regional efforts. So starting with this process map, which again kind of covers domain 2 and 3, and is related specifically to regional coalition building and pediatric surge capacity, we see basically the first question is your hospital part of a regional disaster coalition? And this is structural measure number 2A. This should be something that should be identifiable through communicating with whoever does emergency management that you've identified in domain 1 as your emergency manager, or contact within emergency management. If it seems like this is not possible or you're unclear, referring to your HPP contact list and reaching out may assist you in identifying if you are in fact part of a regional disaster coalition. I think one of the struggles that we see in disaster work in general is that sometimes things can be a little bit fragmented and people are kind of working in separate silos and maybe don't know what the other people are doing that work in this space. So again, this is a contact that may be able to help you determine if your hospital or facility is involved or included in any sort of regional coalition. If you are in fact included in a regional coalition, then the question becomes, or the next step includes identifying what type of external entities are engaged with that regional disaster coalition and determining what the pediatric surge capacity for the region is. And this is an optional part, structural measure number 3A. Structural measure 2B really more specifically addresses what type of entities are engaged in that regional disaster coalition. And I think what our really key focus here is recognizing and identifying the wide range of organizations and entities that should be included in regional disaster planning. These include things like schools and daycares, other healthcare facilities, EMS agencies, can be kind of extremely wide-reaching and involve a number of different types of entities. And so we'd like to see who is actually engaged in whatever specific regional disaster coalition you may find your hospital to be a part of. The second one, which is this optional structural measure number 3A, is a little bit more challenging, I think, for an individual institution to pursue on their own. But I think within the structure of the regional disaster coalition, the question is probably much more readily available, as a number of these coalitions have ways of tracking pediatric bed capacity for their region, et cetera, through a number of different ways, some electronic, some much more simplified. But again, reaching out to this regional disaster coalition and identifying a contact individual within that coalition is going to be paramount to the success of some of these optional structural measures, which we'll discuss. And it's going to be essentially akin to that your extremely important contact within emergency management locally. So kind of looking at things from a local/regional perspective, they're going to be kind of your regional assistance when trying to address and answer some of the questions that we're going to be diving further into. Moving along, what you'll see on the next slide is kind of looking and seeing, and again, this is an optional piece to the disaster bundle, has your hospital ever conducted or participated in a regional disaster drill? So oftentimes these regional disaster coalitions will support and conduct regional drills that include not just your facility, but a number of other facilities and some of these other entities as mentioned in the red box above, schools, daycares, et cetera. And so our hope is if you have participated in one of those, trying to identify through the regional disaster coalition what external partners were engaged in that drill, and compare that list to a provided list of suggested entities to engage, and then identifying what percentage of those entities were engaged in the last drill. And as you can see, this list of suggested entities to engage could be very universal in its approach. There may be obviously some regional specific or local specific entities that may not be universal, but you can imagine that this is something that ourselves as your subject matter experts, or that your point hospitals may be able to assist in the formulation of this list. And then it's really just comparing and identifying what percentage of these entities were engaged in that last drill. Should you have participated in it? And that's going to be process measure number 2E. Now, obviously, it's likely or possible that you have not conducted or participated in a regional drill, and if that's the case, it's again going to be a matter of fact of reviewing a list of suggested entities to engage, and then conducting a tabletop drill with participation from all relevant entities. And you're going to see in the next process map, as well as in this map, we discuss the conducting of a tabletop drill. I think that, this may seem kind of like a daunting exercise, but this is going to be somewhat pivotal to the success of completion of this bundle. And again, something I think that with our guidance and hopeful support, and with Iriel's disaster scenarios she's going to be mentioning later in this call, hopefully it's something that you can do with the assistance of both regional and local support in the form of your emergency manager at your facility, as well as the regional disaster coalition leadership. And then identifying, similarly to the red box on the other arm of the process map, what percentage of the entities were engaged in this drill. And then really just looking at the end of this drill at what percentage of children were correctly identified for interfacility transfer. And again, this is an optional process measure, number 3E, but looking to see kind of specifically during the course of the drill, were there children that required transfer from one facility to other facilities, and did it seem like this transfer that was suggested during the tabletop drill was appropriate? So again, kind of big picture for this map is really looking at coalition building and pediatric surge from a regional standpoint, and looking kind of to begin with, looking at where your facility sits and their involvement and engagement with any sort of regional coalition regional healthcare coalition that may be working on similar efforts that we're trying to unroll locally at your facility. And then once you've identified that, it really just becomes an issue of if you have or have not participated as a facility in a regional tabletop drill. And if not, we suggest conducting a tabletop drill. You'll see in the next process map that we also suggest conducting a tabletop drill in that map. And this drill could be the same drill. It could all kind of be covered with in one shot with one tabletop drill, trying to minimize kind of the work that would need to go into these things. And with that, I again would ask for any questions from anybody on the call as we kind of complete this process map that looks again at kind of regional capacity and regional coalition building, and move more towards kind of local capacity and local coalition building.
And again, please answer or put any questions into the chat box, and we will go ahead and direct those.
No
and I think again, oh, sorry, no questions?
No questions.
Okay, and I think again, really what our hope is that these maps could be, something that you're gonna kind of be able to print out and kind of check things off these boxes as you complete things, scribble on them and mess with them, but really something that we hope can kind of simplify the big picture of things and hopefully prevent kind of duplication of work locally, as probably reaching out to some of these individuals that do some of this work. You're going to be able to get a lot of these answers and specifics from those individuals, and then basically identifying what things are missing. And essentially, if there are things missing, then that would be the place where you'd really just be conducting this tabletop drill to try to get kind of to the missing points and missing pieces of information and data. Moving on to the last of the process maps. This one covers kind of jointly domains 2, 3, and 4, and again is kind of looking at coalition building, but much more from a local, within your facility viewpoint and perspective, as well as pediatric surge capacity, but again locally kind of within your facility, and essential pediatric resources. So identifying what those resources would be and how readily available they are, who's really involved locally in drills and emergency management at your facility, and what that all looks like. And I think kind of from a personal perspective and kind of anecdotal for myself, I think what we oftentimes see is that, given that there are CMS regulations and Joint Commission requirements regarding the need for drills, what we see is that sometimes, all too often, these drills kind of take place in an individualized silo, maybe involving the emergency center, but possibly not going much further beyond that at a hospital, if even involving them. And what our hope with this process map in domains 2, 3, and 4 is really recognizing the importance of expanding these drills beyond the walls of the emergency center only, and to engage kind of both clinical departments and facilities that would be integral, obviously, in any sort of disaster response. So looking and working our way through this process map, it again really starts with a question of whether or not your hospital has conducted any hospital-wide disaster drills. And I think while we say kind of hospital-wide, what we're really meaning is any sort of drill that involves more than one kind of clinical entity, that's kind of broader reaching than, say, 20 patients presenting to the emergency center at once, and emergency center clinical staff working through that workflow, whether it be in a tabletop format or in an actual exercise. And if the answer to that is yes, then given that this should have been kind of more of a hospital-wide or beyond the EC drill, were partners engaged, and listing all of the partners engaged in that drill, and then all of the departments or sections in the hospital, is kind of the moving down this yes arm of this question. Ultimately getting to what percentage of the departments were engaged in that last drill. So seeing that this is kind of everyone that was engaged, these are all the departments, and then finding out a percentage for the hospital of who was actually engaged and participated in that drill. If you find that you have conducted a hospital-wide drill, but local partners weren't engaged, you're going to basically try to list all of the departments in the hospital again. And then if you notice that you haven't conducted a tabletop drill, we're going to point you back to some of these domain 1 resources that we've previously mentioned that you can find in the resource guide that was mentioned by Dr. Remick at the beginning of my talking points, that have some resources regarding the conducting of a tabletop drill. And then again, going to listing all of the departments in the hospital. And this is with the end ultimately of hopefully conducting a tabletop drill with participation from all relevant departments. So across the bottom, we'll see that, again, looking at if you had conducted a drill, what percent of the departments were engaged in that last drill. If you had not, then obviously we need to conduct a drill with participation from all relevant departments, but really suggesting that maybe regardless of what's happened, if you've done one of these or not, going back to conducting this drill to try to see if we can improve things, and how many people were then participating in this newer drill that you're conducting. And these are process measures number 2C. And then again, I think important to this is during the drill, how long did it take to recruit these internal departments? So looking specifically at kind of communications plans within your facility, and how long does it take to activate these different resources that are so critical and needed in a disaster situation. Moving on to the final component of this process map is really a close look at after having, during the course of this tabletop drill that we're suggesting you run through, which again could include some of the things from that last process map if you decide to include regional partners in it, is looking more specifically at both clinical and facilities-based processes and surge, as well as resources and supplies. And these really cover process measures number 3, B, C, and D, as well as process measure number 4A. So again, during the course of the drill, really trying to think in an extremely kind of robust and rich way as you're working through the drill, how long it takes to identify what the surge capacity for the emergency department is, how long it takes to identify with the surge capacity for surgical services, and how long it takes to identify surge capacity for inpatient services. So again, you can envision that you're conducting this tabletop drill and you're including surgical, emergency, inpatient services. You're kind of recognizing how long it takes to notify and activate those services that they do indeed have patients coming from whatever the surge event may be. And then noting how long it takes them to then sit down and say, this is what our surge capacity is in the emergency department. This is what our surge capacity is for the OR. And this is what our surge capacity is for inpatient services. And those, again, are going to be process measures number 3, B, C, and D. Similarly, kind of mirroring that clinical response regarding surge capacity is going to be a conversation that's more facilities-based, looking at the determination of essential pediatric equipment and supplies needed by whoever's kind of assisting in making sure and mobilizing those resources during this tabletop drill. So just as you would be notifying the emergency department of the event and OR and inpatient services, you would also need to be notifying someone from facilities covering a wide range of things, including things like getting these pediatric supplies and equipment ready and available for deployment, and how long does it really take to determine which of those supplies are available, which we need to get access to, and what they are, and again, how readily available they are. So I hope that kind of looking through this as kind of a very stepwise way, and kind of very piecewise way, we hope that this can be something much more manageable than it can come out on paper, and again, the thing that we'd like to do is kind of recognize that these tabletop drills that can sometimes be extremely simple in their appearance and maybe not require a lot of resources to pull off, but maybe a lot of resources to engage, could be kind of drilled through and done with very limited resources from a standpoint of, this isn't something where you need to get 50 high school kids in full moulage makeup coming to your facility. It can be really as simple as working through, sitting down at a table in a conference room with a number of hospital leaders and working through some of these events and getting to the bottom of some of these questions. And dependent upon how you want to approach it, you could do, again, one drill that's kind of more specifically looking locally at your facility and one drill that's looking more regionally, or kind of maybe working with some of the resources available regionally to conduct a drill that kind of both addresses these regional capacity and regional coalition building questions as well as these local ones. And with that, again, kind of pause for questions. Please remember to type in the chat box if you have any questions, and I'm happy to answer additional questions at this point. And I see that Dr. Krug did make a comment, which I think is extremely relevant in that, sometimes these drills can be very, very disruptive, especially if you're doing kind of a full-scale exercise or something with a lot of moving parts and real people moving through things, which are obviously the richest types of these drills. But I think, involving these people and involving leadership is important to kind of see how this is going to play out in a real event.
Just to continue on his comment, because I don't think everyone can see his comment, Dr. Krug said that because they can be so disruptive, there is a tendency to limit the departments that are participating, such as just the ED alone. And so in a true disaster, it's likely that all departments would be involved, and that's why it's so important to include internal departments and hospital leadership in implementing these drills.
And again, speaking kind of a bit anecdotally on this from my perspective with the work that I've done at Texas Children's, I think what we've really found overwhelmingly the response has been is that these other groups that have sometimes been limited in their involvement and participation are actually extremely eager to participate. And I think this is, we've unfortunately been witness to a number of kind of horrible tragedies in our country that I think support and recognize the need for this type of work and the importance of it. And people, what we have found are extremely willing to kind of spend some of their own time and effort, et cetera, participating in these drills, because they recognize the importance at their healthcare facility of being prepared for some of these types of events. So it's really kind of hard to keep up with how many people have really reached out and said, how can we get more involved? Or even we want specific drills just for things like the operating room, et cetera. But we've really expanded the scope of our drills to really almost include every facet of the facility, from both kind of a clinical as well as facilities angle.
Crystal, are there any additional questions?
No, not at this time.
And again, we will be at the end of this call mentioning office hours, which I'll be available for to help. And really, I think the key to this is, we want you all to be successful in working through aspects of this bundle and the different domains. And, again, want to just put myself out there as being available to assist in any way possible to that success. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So moving on, as we mentioned, in line with everything that Dr. Kasny just covered, is that there will be an environmental scan with this bundle, just as there are with the other bundles. So if you recall, once your GUAs are submitted, you'll have access to the IHI modules as well as the environmental scans. And the purpose of this is really just to understand your current process that's in place for disaster preparedness efforts, so that you can identify the gaps and then identify what those change strategies will be. So this environmental scan will essentially walk you through those different components that Dr. Kasny just covered, and we'll be able to help you to identify what your next best steps will be moving forward. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Ariel Johnson-Fusco, who's going to be talking briefly about the disaster scenarios.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, great. Hi, this is Ariel Johnson-Fusco. As I mentioned, I'm one of the Pediatric Emergency Medicine Fellows at Del Children's Hospital, associated with the University of Texas at Austin. And I did help to work on these disaster scenarios as part of the disaster bundle, and to provide a resource for the sites to use in their local disaster drills. Crystal, I don't know if you can go to the next slide. I don't have access at this point.
You actually have access, so go ahead and hit enter on. There you go. I can see you moving your mouse. Hit enter on your keyboard. There you go.
Oh,
go.
There you go. Okay, thank you. So I helped to work on these scenarios. The goal was to create a resource for the sites to use to help them, each site, to create their local disaster drills and assess their preparedness and performance. And this specific bundle is in contrast to the other bundles because those focus on actual patient care. And obviously we don't want to create a disaster. Our goal is to try to just utilize drills and scenarios to prepare for a possibility of a disaster. So again, I created this resource so that sites can use it and not have to create their own drills from scratch. And they're based on common scenarios that should be targeted to pretty much any geographic area in the U.S. And so they should be easily relatable to any things that your sites may encounter. And these are pretty much here just to set the stage to create a simulated drill and initiated preparedness efforts with your sites. Each of our scenarios that I posted, they have a broad overview of an event, and then your sites can specifically choose which number of potential patients they would want to involve in the drill, the ages of those patients, where they are in terms of critical status, so that they can take the appropriate determination of their own specific needs. We didn't provide any specific number of patients for these scenarios because every site has a different number that would qualify as a surge for their area. And so we allow that to be determined by each site. But we do recommend that they be scaled appropriately to reflect the percentage of patients, pediatric patients, that each site sees on average within a given time frame. So again, these are just the domains that we've talked about multiple times during this talk today. I really wanted to reiterate that the goal is for each scenario to be able to be used for all of these domains. So the site would pick a scenario, and the goal would be to walk through the drill and focus on any or all of the domains if that is what the site chooses to do. So we expect each site to have different specific goals that they want to focus on based off of their starting points with this bundle, intervention bundle. So one site may specifically decide that they want to, focus solely on determining their local surge capacity, while another site may decide they want to look at surge capacity, but also want to assess whether or not they have access and the need for essential pediatric resources. And on top of that, they may also want to measure the response times for different departments within their hospital. So each of these scenarios presented should be able to be used for all of those domains, and so they all can have multiple uses. So now I'm just going to go really quickly through the scenarios. There's 6 that I have provided. The first one is a school bus accident. This scenario involves obviously multiple children. You can use any age you'd like. And specifically, I put in a timing of the incident as well as weather that could be an issue for a site. So rush hour and a rainy day, that could be something that you would want to assess with your site in terms of your drill. And not only do you have patients that they have to assess the patient's need, but here we also have the media picked up the story, and so they're going to be arriving to the ED as well. So you can have your site determine how to appropriately balance taking care of patients along with how to handle communication and dissemination of information to the media while providing that care. The second scenario focuses on an active shooter at a school. Again, this scenario has specific clinical concerning with trauma. But one of the things to think about with this is that the site specifically is learning about the course of events as they are occurring, just along with the general public. So the goal is now preparing for unknown number or types of injuries. So that's something that maybe sites would want to look more into. And also now you have family members coming in trying to determine if their family members were victims in this event. So again, having to communicate and disseminate information while also preparing for an influx of patients is something to keep in mind. The third scenario involves flooding. And this specific event is in the middle of the night, when most sites work on a skeleton crew. So not only are you working on the clinical aspect of the patient, problems of drowning and near drowning and hypothermia, but you also have the concerns of getting in additional resources from the area, whether that's specifically specific resources or specific staff members, because now you have flooding, they have some problems with getting into the hospital. So it's working on limited resources and how you would be prepared to take on that scenario. The fourth scenario involves a bomb explosion. So now your sites are dealing with blast injuries or trauma that they may not usually be used to seeing, especially if they're the closest site to the incident. And in the future, there's ability for this to involve a quote unquote dirty bomb, where you also have to think about there being a risk of cross-contamination or contamination. Obviously that's for our phase 2, but keep that in mind that that's something that we can also look at for this specific scenario, is having sites think about their decontamination process along with all of the rest of the things that they're working on. The fifth scenario involves a fire. And this one is specifically spread to include a daycare. So your concern here, obviously, several pediatric patients on the younger end of the age spectrum. This could be a very big problem for certain centers that may not be seeing very small children. So you have concerns for pediatric resource scarcity as well as bed scarcity for any patients that wind up needing more definitive care. And then you also have the concern with the fact that these patients are not with their family members. So then you have, again, this is phase 2, but you have a possibility of thinking about family reunification and identifying these patients, because many of them are probably not old enough to tell you exactly much about their history or their identity. And lastly is specifically a carbon monoxide exposure. I actually noticed this scenario does have a specific number of patients listed. It doesn't give a specific age range, but ages, but it gives an age range. So I may reformulate this scenario, or we could use it as a given scenario for each site to use to determine their current ability to just handle this type of surge and to handle this type of clinical presentation. So those are the 6 different scenarios that we came up with. And again, I only kind of hit on little small nuggets within those scenarios that you can focus on, but the goal is that you should be able to pretty much evaluate and assess your site's ability to handle all the different domains with each of these scenarios. And with that, I'll hand the
Great. Thanks, Ariel. And again, if you all have any questions, please go ahead and place them in the chat box. And I'm just going to turn it back to Crystal to finish up with some housekeeping details.
Thanks, Kate. So our plan is to host disaster-specific office hours on August 14th and September 25th. During this hour-long session, anyone from your team can join and ask questions related specifically to the disaster bundle. Dr. Brent Kasny will be on the line, as well as members of the PRQC admin team. Just as a reminder, all the content that you viewed today is available on our file sharing site. You'll see the link that's listed here. So if you visit this site, go under Intervention Bundles, and then go specifically to Bundle 4, disaster planning. You will see all of the resources, the workflows that are mentioned with comprehensive guidebooks, meaning you'll see the workflow, and then there will be a very large PDF document that has the actual articles embedded in the documents from those workflows. The checklist that Brent mentioned is included in that folder. You'll see it actually says start here, and that's that EMSC checklist. The slides from today are posted, and we will also be posting a recording of today's session for future viewing with your teams. A couple of housekeeping issues. Don't forget that we really need you all to establish your data use agreements, and so please reach out to your trainer if you have any concerns, or Eddie Zamora. And the next learning session, which will be specific to the collaborative in general, where we'll be sharing updates and discussing our next steps, will be on August 28th. And if you have any questions, please let our team know. Don't forget, we are offering CNE and CME credit for today's session, and so the link is listed here. And the name of the learning session that you attended was the Disaster Deep Dive Part 2. So are there any questions for the panelists or for our team at this time? Okay, Kate, any parting words? Brent, Ariel, for the team?
But hopefully this is helpful, that this breaks it down a little bit for those of you that are considering this intervention bundle. And again, remember that you all are not going to be limited to any one single intervention, but recognizing that this one tends to be a little bit bigger just by nature of it. But thanks very much to Dr. Kasny and Dr. Johnson-Fusco for pulling together those process maps and scenarios, and for guiding us down this implementation path, and also to the subject matter experts that helped in the development of this. So if there are any last questions, great. If not, then we can certainly end a little bit early.
Thanks, everyone.